The following was recorded at the CCHF Conference 2023 in Cincinnati.
Thank you, and thank you for joining the last workshop of the conference. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. And I see some people have these glasses. Can I get three more volunteers? The first session I had enough for everybody, but now I'm running out of these glasses. Can I give it to? Okay. I'm gonna give. This is gonna be part of the talk. Just hold it for now, and then okay. Sorry, don't have too many, but you can buy them on Amazon. So, but my name's Warren Yamashita. I'm joining you all from Santa Ana, Southern California, from the Hertz Family Health Clinic, and really excited to come to you to talk about this topic. One story of two stigmas, racism, or the opioid crisis and racism in America. I've also been serving with the addiction medicine section, really creating a space, and I'm so excited at this conference this year to see so many topics diving into these issues, especially with the opioid crisis and really the polydrug epidemic. And then I also serve remotely on adjunct faculty with the Stanford Addiction Medicine Fellowship, teaching their stigma and disparities curricula. The frame for the talk is really Acts 1:8. And we'll be journeying together through this. It reads, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth." And we can't talk about stigma without journeying to Samaria together. So the American Psychiatry Association has 3 types of stigma that they talk about. One is public stigma, negative attitudes towards others. But then there's also self-stigma, negative attitudes and beliefs about oneself, often carrying shame. And then there's institutional stigmas, which are structural in nature and can be ingrained into systematic policies that limit opportunities for certain people unjustly. And it's important to note that the institutional stigmas can be intentional or unintentional. And in the context of CCHF, it's also important for us to have our Ephesians 6 lens as well of the spiritual nature, that we're not just warring against flesh and blood, but against spiritual principalities therein. I think Romans 1:21 captures stigma well from the spiritual lens when it reads, "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened." And I think even as believers knowing Jesus, he's opened our hearts and our minds, but there's still a continual renewing of the heart and the mind for our whole lives too. So I think Romans 1:21 still applies to us as we renew our whole self. And speaking of our whole self, I wanted to start the stigma talk with the end in mind. How many of you are familiar with Dallas Willard? Okay, some hands, yeah. I got to study under him at USC. He's a Christian philosopher and writer. And in his book, The Renovation of the Heart, he captures the biblical worldview of what a person is with this nice visual diagram. So I think in the context, I was just at the Spiritual Care for Post-Soul talk, but in our modern context, we often live in this materialism world, this post-soul world that really views us more materially, especially in healthcare. But I think this conference we're with like company to remember that a person has a spirit with a heart and a will, but we're not disembodied spirits. We're embodied. We have a mind with thoughts and feelings within a body, a finite body that we get to navigate the world with, but we're not alone. We get to navigate it with people in the context of community and relationship with others. And the totality of who we are is encapsulated with our soul. And stigma so much blinds our perception of who we are and how we see others. I think, even going back to the fall itself, that when we lost when Adam and Eve fell and we lost that relationship with the Father and our ability to see ourselves through his eyes, we then lost our ability to see each other. I think the fig leaves with Adam and Eve putting on as they lost their ability to even see themselves. And so in many ways, that's what stigma does. It mars our ability to see who we truly are. And this talk will be, not only going into the depth, really like Brian Stevenson's talk was so powerful. And if you ever get a chance to go to the truth-telling centers, the Legacy Museum and the Lynching Memorial, highly recommend it. It was just, for me, just very, very transformative. But we're going to go there. We're going to dive into narrative and do the hard work of digging into things that are uncomfortable together. This is the part of the talk. Again, I ran out of these glasses at the first session, so for those that do have them, go ahead and put on your glasses. I'll put them on with you. If you don't get a headache, you can wear them the whole time with me. And then maybe for those that are next to each other, look into your eyes and shout out what color eyes you see the other person have through your stigma filter glasses. So. Yeah. All right. So I know you all don't have them, but I'll wear them with you. You can imagine putting on your glasses with me, and it's actually hard to see you all now. Yeah. So we have our glasses on. And I mentioned, traveling to Samaria together. One of the frames of this talk is really seeing how Jesus encounters the Samaritan woman at the well in the middle of the day, in the heat of the day. And at that time, we can't talk about Samaria without talking about the stigma they had, especially the stigma Jews had for Samaritans, seeing Samaritans as unclean people. And for Jesus even to approach and interact with a Samaritan would have been making himself unclean for multiple reasons. One is that they were seen as racially and ethnically impure with Jewish roots before, but then intermarrying with other races, but then also interwoving other religions into their Abrahamic roots. And so they were even seen to be religiously impure as well. So really, to the Jews, an outcasted people. And for Jesus to approach the Samaritan woman, he would have also been approaching an unclean person amongst those outcasted people. And why was she unclean? Because she was defined by her behavior, her sin. And even amongst the Samaritans, she was not welcome, right? I think most of us are familiar with the story, but we'll talk a little bit about what that behavior was. But because of that sin, that reputation, she went during the noonday to get water during the heat of the day versus when the sun was set, like the rest of the community, because of that stigma. And the Samaritan woman, she was a well of both the public and the self-stigma. Even in their short encounter, she highlights these two stigmas of saying, you're not supposed to be interacting with me, this Jewish man. When she says to him, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. And then as they go on and Jesus asks for water from the woman and offers her, starts to offer her living water, he says to her, go, call your husband and come here. And the woman answered him, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, what you are saying is right. I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have, is not your husband. What you have said is true. And as we go through this talk, really, this interaction, I think, informs so much of the context of the topics today when we talk about racism and stigma to people based off of their behavior or sin or addiction, right? So in today's context, how we divide ourselves by race and ethnicity, but also even by immigration status or people coming into the country with different beliefs, different views, and how in America we still divide between these people and have outcasted categories. And then on an individual level, for those self-stigmas, how we define people as unclean, and even especially for people struggling with substance use disorders or even behavioral processing disorders like sex addiction, gambling, shopping, social media addiction. How people struggling with addictions are sometimes the most unwelcome in our own churches, and how we can carry these stigmas, and also within our healthcare institution. And having talked about the fall and the Samaritan woman, it's important to frame that these stigmas are older than this nation itself is, but we imported these stigmas at the start of our nation. And the Declaration of Independence is a good marker of that, right? So that it excluded all black people. We imported slavery at the start of our nation to start the nation. Even though it was trying to be founded on godly principles, at the very start, racism was embedded. And one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, one of the first American psychiatrists, Dr. Benjamin Rush, he actually tried to argue to his colleagues in this publication that addiction was a disease that deserved to be treated like any other medical condition with a medical model. But at that time, he was very ahead of his time. He was a minority. The other psychiatrist colleagues still saw it as a moral failing, a sin that people needed to turn from and repent. And so at the start of the nation, we imported the moral failing model of addiction. And 250 years later, we're starting to have these conversations after the opioid crisis that we're currently in, and we're starting to tie these stories together. About 2016 was about the time that the American consciousness started to wake up to the opioid crisis on a societal level, when we had overdoses from opioids starting to surpass deaths from motor vehicle accidents. And that's, the idea there is that anyone can die from a car accident. And so what about, people that we know that can have been affected by substance use? And so this is the part of the talk where I'll ask, anyone who either themselves or for a close loved one have struggled or recovered from addiction, whether a behavior or a substance, if you can raise your hand and go ahead and leave those hands raised. And then for everyone else, if you've interacted with people within your context, whether at school or work or church, that have struggled with an addiction of those types. So, and that's what we're, viscerally, that everyone has encountered. And so this now is something that we can no longer ignore and tuck away with stigma. But this is if there's any silver lining to the crisis that we're going through, it's creating a space for us to talk about this and to begin to tell new narratives that can break through the stigma, and to see how Jesus fits into all of this too. Just to put the crisis into context, the graph on the left is by Jalal in 2018. And what you can see there is the different overdose rates by different types of substances and the different colors. What Jalal did in the study, which was interesting, was he actually added all those mortality curves together to a cumulative curve for overdoses by any type of substance, and found it fit onto an exponential curve. An exponential curve without a decreasing slope. And it's a disturbing curve, and one we are continuing to face with all of you, where you're at, and in every community, and with all our health centers. But how did we get here, and what is some of the historical context? So there's actually an addiction there's such a thing as an addiction historian. David Herzberg over at the University of Buffalo has started to piece together the past really the 2 centuries and the last century of history. And something that I would ask that we kind of take away from Herzberg's work is if you're going to remember any legislative act, to remember these 2 acts, the 1906 Food and Drug Act, and then the 1914 Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. And that FDA Act really was the start of the Food and Drug Administration, the regulation of safe consumption of foods and drugs, the regulations of prescriptions. And then 8 years later, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, defining narcotic sales outside of the doctor's office as taxable. Sounds benign, sounds, what's the harm with that? But these are some of the institutional, the start of the institutional stigmas within our country for these two stigmas. This is a busy graph. But what I did here was I combined Jalal's 2018 graph with Herzberg's graph to establish a timeline from 1890 to the present, to know, and on so the x-axis you have time from 1890 to the present. On the y-axis, Jalal has the overdose rates. For the Herzberg graph, the y-axis is not overdoses. It notes annual daily doses or sold for morphine, sedatives, and amphetamines. But putting them together gives context over the last 100 years to really note that this is not the first time the United States has gone through an opioid crisis. The first time was 100 plus years ago. And how did that one start? It started with the invention of the hypodermic needle that came to the US in 1856 and provided the ability to administer things IV, medicines, drugs IV, and now morphine IV. At that time, cocaine was prevalent too. And so you had a nation that started using morphine with the hypodermic needle in an unregulated way, both in the doctor's office and in the community, sold with no rules. And it started to cause problems, right? So you can see that at that, and that was at the turn of the 20th century, really where all Americans of all colors started using drugs, and it created a problem that the government needed to manage. It needed to regulate, and that really led to the founding of the FDA to start regulations within the doctor's office and pharmacies, with the real belief that if there was more parameters around prescribing, if there was on labeling of risks, addiction risks, overdose risks, that these rational healthcare providers and patients would make the right choices. And then 8 years later, the Harrison Narcotic Tax Act followed to start to regulate drug use outside of the doctor's office, starting with taxes, but then eventually making sales outside of the doctor's office illegal. And once illegal, there needed to be, once illegal, arrestable, and once arrestable, there needed to be an entity to regulate incarceration of narcotics outside the doctor's office. And really, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act was the predecessor to the agency that became in 1973 the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, which is now our modern-day drug enforcement agency. And so as for the prescribers here, we have our FDA-approved drugs and our DEA license, and these are the entities that guide our practice. And we won't go through every law and legislation here, but now in the 21st century, we've declared it as the opioid crisis a public health emergency. But we've had over 100 years of experience in the US with regulation, and it's a complicated web. Here's the timeline from Herzberg's article, and and what he does well is he goes through the legislative history, but then he does what's really interesting is he starts to connect the legislative history to the public conscience. And what he notes is at the turn of the 20th century, no one was shy about racism in that 1906 period. And well, we'll start with, but these narratives of drug users by race really shaped the formation of those 1906 and 1914 acts. And the one that was the narrative within the doctor's office, he noted that at that time it was mostly white Americans that were coming to doctors, and he noted that mostly it was white women coming to doctors with health problems, symptoms, complaints, coming to the doctor's office and leaving with a narcotic prescription. And in that context, it really had this narrative of white health seekers, rational actors, that if given the right parameters with the Food and Drug Act and pharmaceutical regulations, would make rational choices. And it started to institutionalize the medical narrative and the system and the regulations therein. What about the narratives outside of the doctor's office? There was a minority pleasure seeker narrative, even actually on the Harrison Narcotic Tax Act. On the Wikipedia notes just the public testimonies being given from the public when that act was being discussed. And there were testimonies of concerns about black men using cocaine being a threat to raping white women. Chinamen opium dens that were a threat to the society. And so these were not health seekers. They were just seen as nefarious actors that were just trying to get high and were a danger and a threat to the community. And so that Harrison Narcotics Tax Act eventually led to drug arrest regulations, and then this criminalized narrative and the criminal incarceration system that, I mean, it was just so powerful to have Brian Stevenson join us at this conference and talk about his work with this system. And Herzberg notes that once these narratives began to be institutionalized, and then we had the crack cocaine era and the regulations there, mandatory minimums, the more it got institutionalized, the greater the segregation became. And something he notes is that what was hard about his work was that in the academic literature, the history of these two narratives are academically separate lines of literature. And so what was difficult for his academic work was integrating these two lines of academic work and narratives into one larger story. And he really argues that the starting place we need to start with to address these two stigmas is to understand that these are not separate stories and systems, but they're integrated and they're one story, and to start to desegregate the stories and how we view our institutions and regulations to give us even the possibility to have a more truthful, I love his words, truth-telling, a truthful narrative that can break through the stigma. And with the stigma of addiction, you probably by now have all heard of the disease model of addiction, the disease narrative of addiction, which is a truthful model based off of really the last 2 decades of functional neuroimaging, how we've been able to better understand how substances affect the brain, especially with chronic use on a receptor and circuit level. We've now been able to articulate out the neurobiology of addiction and to define the disease of addiction, the pathophysiology of addiction. So we've, 250 years after Dr. Benjamin Rush, we've now gotten to where he wanted the nation to start with 250 years ago. The field of addiction medicine just became a board-certified, ACGME accredited subspecialty in 2017. So the House of Medicine, just in 2017, has begun to acknowledge that there's a legitimate area of science and medicine around this. But it's complicated, right? Because this is an organ and it's a disease that particularly affects agency. So it's a disease of choice, a disease of agency, which makes it a very complicated disease, especially as Christians, especially with our churches, which kind of have this regulation over choice and morality. And so it's a complicated chronic disease of choice and agency. And if I were to give just a broad or a quick snapshot of the neurobiology of addiction, we just know generally the general brain regions that are involved, the dopamine mesolimbic circuit with the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, which affects binge intoxication phase of addiction. That's the blue areas. And then the extended amygdala system that affects dysphoria or withdrawal that often drives people to reuse a substance. That's in the red area. And then the green area, the regions of the prefrontal cortex, where the prefrontal cortex gets dysregulated, affecting craving, preoccupation and thought, and decreased perception of negative consequences towards substances. And how in concert, these systems getting dysregulated really provide a pathophysiologic basis for understanding the disease of addiction, and also how the medications we have, how they help to stabilize these circuits to start to. I would recommend Pleasure Unwoven as the single best 1-hour presentation for the neurobiology of addiction. You can find it it's only viewable on Vimeo. Dr. McCulley is actually at the Meadows Clinic right now. What's so powerful about that is he shares his own story of recovery from alcoholism as a physician. And then he uses the Utah National Parks to give a visual for the different brain regions to help walk the audience through the disease model of addiction, and really makes a powerful case. And it's an older documentary, but now we have like Hulu dramatized entertainment series on the disease of addiction with Dopesick, Hulu. People are now watching it for entertainment. So we've made a long way with the disease model, and that's so important, because that's been the single most effective tool that the field of addiction medicine has had to address and to decrease stigma and to restore dignity to those struggling and to encourage them into treatment. Because for addiction care, whether now the X waiver is gone, so there's no longer an excuse not to get into the field of addiction, and even just talking to just other passionate people here too of just I think CCHF and the Christian community is ready to enter this space and to really bring this into our services, because medications like buprenorphine or Suboxone dramatically decrease the risk of relapse compared to abstinence. Abstinence has a 90+% rate of relapse and failure, whereas medications like buprenorphine, there's methadone and naltrexone as well, can decrease relapse rates up to 50%. And every time you prevent a relapse, you can prevent an overdose and a death. Those curves on overdose deaths, the number of overdoses is like hundreds of times greater than the deaths. So these drugs are life-saving. Now we even try to move away from the term medication-assisted therapy. They're just medications, like we treat diabetes with medications. We don't use medication-assisted therapy for diabetes. So we've made progress with expanding treatments nationally. In the last 2 decades, buprenorphine prescribing has increased. And this is a study by Lajesty in 2019 showing CMS billing data on the number of buprenorphine visits being billed increasing over the last 2 decades. But when they did a subgroup analysis, they found that it really only increased for white Americans, that buprenorphine treatment was not being expanded for people of color. And with our Herzberg lens, we can really kind of understand why in that medicalized health seeker narrative that when we pushed buprenorphine, it got pushed to that market in the same way that the opioid crisis with Purdue and OxyContin, when they pushed overprescribing of opioids, it got pushed into a white market for a white opioid epidemic. And in the absence, so this is noted throughout the literature from other studies too, noting that people of color are systematically less likely to receive addiction treatment, counseling, and harm reduction services. And when people of color are referred to treatment, they're more likely to be referred to a methadone than a buprenorphine clinic. And as some of you may know, methadone, you have to go every day, risk of arrhythmias. You can still overdose on methadone. It's very different than treating a patient in an outpatient setting with buprenorphine. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, time check. Yeah. Thanks. And there's even geographic studies on this too, noting that in the same way that you can break down segregation by zip code with white and black neighborhoods, the buprenorphine clinics are concentrated in those same white zip codes, and the methadone clinics are concentrated in those same minority or underserved zip codes. And so it's very structural in nature. And in the absence of expanding treatment and into communities of color, the criminal justice system, right, picks up for those outside the medical system. As we know, Black Americans being no more likely to use illicit substances and yet having a much higher, 6 to 10 times being more likely to be incarcerated for drug offenses. Again, in the 80s and 90s, with those new laws with crack cocaine and mandatory minimums, there was a systematic increase to sharp rise in drug arrests in the state and federal prisons, and over half of those arrests were among young Black men in large cities. And so this is not new. This is 100 years plus in the making, and it's really by design. And this has all continued to accelerate after COVID. Substance use increasing as Americans have coped with stress. Now binge drinking is, 1 in 5 Americans are now drinking heavily. And then later we got some data showing that then alcohol-related deaths were noted to go up too. In the same way that COVID affected the legal supply chains for lumber or your refrigerator or furniture, it affected the illicit supply chains as well. Fentanyl and other synthetic opioids, which are much more addicting and potent and deadly, got contaminated into other substances. So now, not uncommon for us to do a urine drug screen, someone only using methamphetamine and informing them they also are using fentanyl. I know on the east you're seeing more xylazine and animal tranquilizers contaminated into things. We see cannabis now having fentanyl in it. I remember during my fellowship, treated a patient who never used opioids, never had an opioid addiction. He was in recovery from methamphetamine, doing well, I think 30 years. And then the COVID stress caused him to relapse on meth, but he was admitted for a fentanyl overdose. And something we saw now after COVID too is we started to see an inversion from white Americans having the highest opioid overdose rates to now Black and American Indian Americans, especially middle-aged men in those populations, having now the highest overdose rates as synthetics continue to increase. And so we're seeing these effects, but what we talked about, the narratives in the past that kind of informed the structures we live within. What are the narratives we tell ourselves now? So Julie Netherland and Helena Hansen did an interesting qualitative study looking at 100 media articles, your New York Times, Atlantic articles from 2001 through 2011. And at that time, fentanyl wasn't really on the scene, it was more heroin. But they noted that these articles really fell into 2 thematic categories. One set of articles really had these sympathetic portrayals of suburban and white prescription opioid users really seen as victims of doctors and pharmaceutical companies. Again, that medicalized health seeker narrative. in the articles that we tell ourselves and tell the American public. And then another set of articles had stories about criminalized urban and Black and Latino illicit heroin injectors. Again, that minority pleasure seeker narrative still resonating in our own consciousness today. And Hansen and Netherland really emphasize here the importance of these narratives, of how they really inform and trickle into not just popular culture, but into our institutions, and House of Medicine is not immune. I think, just bringing in a philosopher of language, Ludwig Wittgenstein, really to emphasize, again, the importance of narrative, how the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And that this is the air we breathe and the water we swim in, and unless we start to dissect, start to lean towards the uncomfortable, it's so easy just to stay in the water that we swim in. So we talked about starting to address the stigma with the disease narrative, but it not being enough, particularly not being enough because it's not reaching people of color. So there is some authors like Helena Hansen and David Herzberg who've teamed up and started to talk about the shortcomings of the disease model. Again, I believe in the disease, I educate my patients on the disease model, but it's not the complete narrative. They argue that the disease model itself can actually sometimes be used to justify the exclusion of people struggling with addiction, in being excluded from society, socially, economically, politically, with this view that they're damaged brains that need to be sorted by the medical or criminal systems that we have in place. And what they argue for is really integrating the disease model with harm reduction narrative. Harm reduction, incredibly, I think, if you talk with your churches, very hard for Christians to talk about harm reduction sometimes. What is harm reduction? And the reason why they're arguing for harm reduction is because the disease model is only reaching, again, the white medicalized health narrative and system, to go outside of the clinic and into the community where drug users are that aren't going to the clinic, and where people of color drug users are that aren't going to the clinic. We need to go to them. And that's the idea for harm reduction, really meeting people where they're at, starting with their goals, and seeing not abstinence as the only goal, but any reduction of harm along the way as a meaningful and valid goal, and participating with the community in that. And so it's really a range of interventions that have those two principles, meeting people where they're at and having any reduction in harm as a valid starting place. And it can include abstinence, but it doesn't have to. And it's also noted that this is it's an umbrella term to note really addressing drug users who are very diverse, who don't fit into that, again, the white health narrative population. And so there's a range of interventions. One is low-dose addiction medicine access. I think, I love that this is, so many FQHCs and underserved clinics are represented because integrating addiction services there is a great way to bring this care to these communities. Bringing buprenorphine to FQHCs is a great way to bring buprenorphine access to the zip codes that don't have buprenorphine clinics. Narcan reversals, fentanyl test strips, so people know that what they're using actually is fentanyl. Good Samaritan laws, so you aren't arrested when you try to call and save your friend's life. And then the last one, which is the most controversial harm reduction intervention, especially in Christian circles, supervised injection sites. But it's a range. And it's important to put harm reduction in the context of everything else we do in healthcare, and to put it in context of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So primary prevention, detecting a disease early, primary prevention, interventions to prevent disease onset, secondary prevention to detect early diagnosis and treatment, but then tertiary prevention in the realm of chronic disease to reduce the harms of that chronic disease. And we do that all the time, for diabetes. We see harm reduction as valid. We don't wait until the patient has started to exercise and eat paleo diet and before we say, now you deserve to get the medicines from us because you've shown that you've put in the work and you're ready. We treat them where they're at, and then we encourage lifestyle and behavior change. And the same with COPD. We don't say, you don't get access to the oxygen or the inhalers. You can just continue with your air hunger. Because you smoked for so long, you were sinning for like 30 plus years of smoking history, so you're just getting what you deserve now. And if they get cancer, we don't withhold cancer treatment from lung cancer because they've smoked. We treat them, and then we encourage them to stop smoking as well, and we get them resources and tools to help them along the way. And this is the same thing for harm reduction for the treatment of addiction, and especially with moderate and severe addictions, and especially for people of color who aren't being serviced by the current healthcare system. I can't do this talk without also adding another portion of the narrative, which is Asian American Pacific Islanders, really breaking through this model minority myth concept, that the myth that Asians don't use drugs. Well, in 1971 in Los Angeles, there was a Japanese American barbiturate and cocaine epidemic. 31 JAs overdosed. And I put the link to this op-ed in the app bio. But it mobilized the community around it. Even though the coroner's office didn't even record a single overdose because of the stigma, the community mobilized and connected with the Asian American Drug Abuse Program that's responded to Asians struggling with substances. And the reason why I mentioned this here regarding stigmas is because Asian Americans have been used as a racial wedge to divide black and white Americans for so long, with the perception that they're a model minority. But it's a myth, and part of that model minority narrative gets perpetuated because of the concept that Asians don't struggle with substance problems too. So we talked about the chronic disease model of addiction, harm reduction, even the model minority myth as a more complete narrative for really understanding the waters that we swim in. But what about, where does Jesus fit into all of this? And this is coming back to the two waters, or actually shifting from one story of two stigmas to one story of two waters with how Jesus encounters the Samaritan woman at the well. And to reframe that interaction a bit, what if the Samaritans shut off access to the well during the day because, only sinners go to the well during the day, so, just lock it up. The woman probably would have died, right? She would have not gotten the basic necessity for life, water. And she would have stopped sinning. She would have died after maybe her first or second husband. But this is the same well. This wasn't just any well. This was Jacob's well. This was the well in Genesis that God poured out in abundance his grace for Jacob and continued to pour out his water that kept people alive until the time that the Samaritan woman came and was still drinking out of that well after third, fourth, fifth, and now the sixth man she was living with. Buying her enough time to meet Jesus so that he can offer her living water. And Jesus didn't also wait at the well during after the sun went down, saying, when's the woman going to show up after sunset because I'm waiting for her? He didn't. He went to her. And I think that touches on this theme of proximity that we've talked about a lot at this conference. And in some ways, that encounter that Jesus had with her, God the Father with that blessing, that well, God was giving her water the entire time, and now Jesus, the Son, was giving her living water. God was giving her water and living water and not making any rules or restrictions to receiving both. They were both given freely, and he was seeing her for who she was. And he says to her, everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. The water I shall give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. and she broke free, right? There was joy. She ran back to her town. Jesus spent 2 days with them. There was a revival breaking out in that town. Jesus had to go because his primary ministry was to the Jews, but he hung out for them for 2 days. She was the forerunner. Her stigma, both types of stigma, were broken through. She was preaching the Messiah, and the crowd didn't want him to leave. And I think this is, part of the narrative of how we get to approach both of these stigmas, racism and addiction stigma, by following Jesus' example. I think the morning plenary today, seeing people through the Father's eyes, and then offering them living water and water together, and letting it just melt away the stigma. And that living water, especially for recovery and the Christian recovery community, you'll hear people in the Christian recovery community describe what's going on in the inner being of the person, that there's a displacing of the substance or the behavior with the Spirit himself. As Paul says in Ephesians 5:18-20, do not get drunk with wine or any drug or behavior or relationship, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. There are testimonies of people's miraculous conversions from turning from fluoride addiction to not a single drink or use thereafter. And God does that sometimes. Most of the time, the person also has to join him with the work, medications, therapy, mutual support groups, and most of the time it's a process. I think for me, when I work with patients that are in recovery, I feel more blessed than I feel like they are sometimes, because of just seeing God's work in their life, whether they are a Christian or not, seeing how he's working in their lives. And one of the, actually this my friend Kent, he's at Biola, he kind of put it this way, that persons with severe addictions are among those contemporary prophets that we ignore to our own demise, for they show us who we truly are. And I want to kind of match some of these scriptural references and these sayings to some of the neuroimaging. If we, with the functional brain imaging, we now have a kind of if there's a neurobiology of recovery, this is it. This is a study out of Yale by Yip and colleagues showing, looking at functional connectome studies, or looking at circuits within the brain that are strengthened or weakened for people that are in long-term recovery from cocaine. So they're abstinent from cocaine, in recovery. In red, you see strengthened circuits. And blue, you see weakened or dampened circuits, connecting all areas of the brain. This is another visual of that same study, showing that these circuits are strengthened on top and weakened on the bottom, and they connect every part of the brain. Recovery is a whole person transformation, integrating all parts of themselves. It's not just the prefrontal cortex. It's not just a conscious. It's a subconscious. It's a physical body transformation too. And what they noted is that these network strengths were actually stronger in those in recovery than those continuing to use cocaine, but also stronger than people that never experienced addiction. One criticism of mutual support groups or 12-step programs is like, oh, they're not using the substance, but they're addicted to the group. Well, every time, what are they doing at the groups? What are they doing when they're doing the 12 steps? Something they're doing is practicing talking, calling someone up when they're having stress, craving, and they're weightlifting. They're strengthening those circuits. And then when that time hits, that stressor, that loss in their life, and everything in their body tells them to go use the substance again, they now have that strong, strengthened circuit to lift that 1,000-pound cell phone to make the call and to continue in recovery. And that's the transformation that the people in recovery do every day. every day in every community there's a mutual support group going on. And the same type of pattern shown to be in opioid. The same study was replicated with opioids, showing again this pattern of strengthened networks. And they've actually labeled it in the literature, people in recovery having this hyperfunctionality. And it shouldn't be a surprise to Christians, because the 12 steps came out of like a Wesleyan Christian revival movement called the First Century Christians that just took the gospel literally and started following, confessing your sins to one another, and the prayers of a righteous person are powerful, and just living that out on a radical, honest, daily basis. But it took us about 100 years, it took us about 80 years as a Christian community to start to reintegrate the 12 steps back into the church with Christ-centered recovery, like Celebrate Recovery, and so many regional movements. But it took the healthcare community, about 100 years to acknowledge that the 12 steps actually work, with the recent Cochrane review looking at 21 randomized controlled trials with the meta-analysis, finding that 12-step programs particularly looking at alcohol use were equal or more effective than cognitive behavioral therapy and motivational enhancement therapy in reducing drinking and its negative consequences. And these groups are free. And so I treat, for my treatment, I offer medications, recommend therapy, and recommend mutual support groups like 12-step groups. But yeah, okay. So kind of going back to the well, we've talked about some of that transformation spiritually, especially in recovery. But it's in the area of Christian addiction medicine and Christian recovery. There's such a division between even healthcare and churches. So my clinic, my FQHC, was born out of the Orange County Rescue Mission. They've asked me next week to give a scriptural defense for addiction medicine and harm reduction. So the burden of proof's on me. So I'm practicing for next week, actually, here. But the way I understand it is that, the church, and especially Christian recovery and churches that have become recovery friendly, like the work that the Delaney's are doing, the church is really good at working on the sin issue. Like, they're really good at connecting people back into community, helping people get their lives back together, helping people, restore. But they tend to be abstinence-based and no medications and no harm reduction. A lot of the programs, like our own partner organization with the Rescue Mission, they have a high threshold for participation. A lot of people can't get into the program because they don't meet all those check boxes, and so these are the people that have to come to the clinic and at the clinic, and my clinic, we do addiction medicine, we have harm reduction practices, and as a healthcare practitioner, we're all about morbidity and mortality, all about reducing death. So harm reduction for us, it's just about that's our lane, but we often get divided about this. You have to do it this way, or you have to do it this way, and this other way is bad. And but I would argue that Jesus came to deliver us from sin and death, not sin or death, and that we benefit by partnering together and learning from our best practices from one another, that we need recovery and medications together. And I think this fits into the larger narrative of the church having had a lot of talks about really understanding the biblical basis for righteousness, but still awkwardly navigating our way through talking about biblical justice in the Old and New Testament, where God's heart is all about justice. And that's the model, and that's why I love CCHF, because that's what we do, right? We get to offer water with healthcare services and tools, And we get to integrate whole person spiritual care and offer living water. We get to offer both. We get to go to the well, the noonday well, and encounter the Samaritan woman with every patient encounter, whether scheduled or walk-in patients. And we get to start to see people through the Father's eyes. And Jesus can handle it all, and that's when he begins to melt away these stigmas. But even at the time when Jesus was doing this, interacting with sinners, he was so criticized. In Matthew 9, and some of the criticisms were, while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." And digging into that, go and learn what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, it refers back to Hosea 6:6 when it says, I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice. And that goes back to Hosea 2 when Hosea gives his prayer and his heart for Gomer, which represents God's heart for Israel, which foreshadows Jesus' work and God's heart, the Father's heart for the nations, to the ends of the earth, including Samaria, those living under stigma. And he pours out this heart that I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice. But he doesn't stop there. And in steadfast love and in mercy, and I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. And what I would argue is that as we get to participate in this and start to see ourselves through the Father's eyes, through this prayer, and the people we encounter, that's when the stigma begins to melt away. So for those of you who, one person has glasses still on, so we can take off our stigma glasses. So I think, let me just stop there. I think one of the questions I have is, how do we continue the community and the work together? I mentioned that we have these monthly workshops with the addiction medicine section, but I'd be interested even with the CCHF community. How do we continue this conversation and integrate these services into our systems and start to break down these structures? Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, I have a question. So this is a great book, very thoughtful, which actually looks at structural racism in medicine from colonial times to the present, and goes through some of these things as well. But also, if you look at chronic pain, I had a patient that accused me of racism, and I was really surprised by it a couple of years ago, and it made me look into all the experience of people that come in that are minorities, and it's so different than what other people experience. And in 2017, there was a study done at University of Virginia where they asked medical students and residents if patients came in and say what their pain was and how much they took them seriously, and they found that there was a significant difference between black and whites as far as people accepting their pain. And it goes then to imaging, use of opioids, and a bunch of other things. And so many of our patients have addiction, also have chronic pain. And I just think that there's you could probably extend your whole talk to chronic pain as well, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and for those who couldn't hear, talking about how stigma works its way into the area of chronic pain, and I think that's so important to acknowledge too, that people who don't have addiction, who are on controlled substances for chronic pain, when you talk about tapering opioids and benzodiazepines, that itself is this whole, and so for me, I'm so excited. There's another addiction medicine fellow here, but but part of that, like the addiction training, is also doing tapers too. So. Yeah. Yeah, and any other questions, comments?
I just really want to commend the book you referenced,
Medical Apartheid.
Washington.
Yeah.
It's a classic, and if anyone's interested in health equity, they should be familiar with it.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, yeah.
I have a question. So I'm just curious your thoughts on the legalization of marijuana and Black and brown communities owning dispensaries as a form of like restorative justice. I don't know if you've heard this. And because I was telling somebody that, I'm seeing a lot of my patients, younger patients who are chronic marijuana users, and that, there's this kind of widespread narrative that it's, completely harmless, that, and I know that changes based on age. People under the age of 25 to bring this form. But I'm just curious your thoughts on that. And it is a form of restorative justice. People owning dispensaries, those communities that have historically harmed by the drug war. And I'm just seeing this more and more and more. And I'm just curious your thoughts as an addiction medicine.
Yeah. I mean, the question was my thoughts on cannabis legalization, particularly being seen in some of the context of restorative justice and decriminalization, which, it's this super complex narrative because it affects two systems, the healthcare and the criminal justice system. And I completely agree with the decriminalization. It's interesting, though, how you noted that carries into the healthcare system. And I've had healthcare colleagues that's like, oh, yeah, it's completely harmless. You could use marijuana, but then seeing it now in our younger generation, I think, adolescent addiction treatment, the places I was trained, the goal is really abstinence for adolescents, and working there is the goal. Adolescents being up to age 26, because of how we know that early use of addictive substances increases one's lifelong risk of addiction. So really trying to protect the brain during that time, but balancing that how do we still talk about decriminalization while still having not then saying it's fine to use it, but still acknowledging the medical, how it affects the brain, and how do we support that? I think in California when they did their legalization, there was supposed to be a lot of money diverted to adolescent prevention and treatment, and then the funds got diverted away and from that and used for something else. So yeah, decriminalization, but then how do we do the prevention side and the education side too? So yeah. Yep. No, we're time. Oh, right, yeah. All right, well, thank you, everyone, and for joining.